Gosh, there are quite a lot of you. I don't get this kind of reception from my students, but it's the end of term. Thank you very much for the generous introduction. Thank you to How to Academy for inviting me, and thank you to Akala for coming to do this event together. It's a real thrill, and what a wonderful chance to come and talk about the past, the present, and the future. So I'm going to do a sort of short, overarching talk. Then we'll have a discussion, and then maybe some questions, and if you don't have any questions, we can have a glass of wine or something different. So I'm here to talk about the Silk Roads of the past, present, and future. When I was a boy and I went to school, and I suspect most of you who've been educated in this country had a similar sort of education, the first thing I learned about was the Greeks, actually, and then I learned about the Romans in Britain. You'll see on the screen behind me, hopefully, yes. And then there's a 1,000-year gap until the Norman Conquest. I didn't hear a single word about anything that happened between the Romans in Britain and William the Conqueror, presumably because nothing significant happened anywhere in the world at all. And even as a boy, I realized that was slightly unusual. So I could almost understand starting with the Norman Conquest, but I couldn't understand why we start with Rome and then have this sort of more or less 1,000 years of silence. I then learned about the Crusades, which was sort of quite exciting as a boy, learning about castles and knights and so on, and somehow that you could beat people up and God would be okay with it was quite useful in the playground. Then I learned about Henry VIII and his wives. We can all name Henry VIII and his wives. Definitely bad husband, bad king, good king, who knows, but I don't know. No one can argue, I think at university, no one can argue he was a good husband. But then I learned about the Tudors. We love the Tudors in this country. The French Revolution and the tumultuous changes when the Battle of Waterloo happened. I gave a talk in France last week, and I was talking about how history is taught and so on, and I had to replace Duke of Wellington with Napoleon, because the French think of Napoleon as a great winner in history, and when you say the Battle of Waterloo, they literally say, never heard of it. Moscow, well, it's a little bit of embroidery, okay, maybe that's fair, but each country has its own sort of take or its own version of the heroes of this period of, of Europe starting to conquer the world. Then I learnt, as all of you will have done, you learnt about the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo that triggered the First World War, the horrible conditions on the Western Front that we've been commemorating a couple of weeks ago, the 100th anniversary of the end of that terrible war. Then we learn about, children these days, they learn about Emmeline Pankhurst. I wasn't taught about suffragettes, I wasn't taught about women and equality. I kept being told that the West was a very equal society, and it came as a bit of a shock later on to find out that at my own university, women weren't allowed to graduate 100 years ago. Women who did better than the men, they were allowed to sit the exams, but they weren't given a certificate, and their results didn't count. It's quite new, in fact, these kinds of equalities. We're a very unequal society here in Western Europe. We'll talk about that, I'm sure. Everybody knows the great tyrants of the 20th century, Hitler and Stalin, the terrible things they did in the names of their crazy ideas. Then Martin Luther King, wonderful man who produced wonderful speaker, but introduced the idea that equality wasn't just about women. There were other ways in which inequalities still survive in the 20th century. And with children of my own, it comes as a profound shock to them to realize how recent these inequalities really are in our world. But anyway, this is the story of history as we know it, and of course JFK. We used to think he was a great president, but these days historians are a bit more divided. So that's the kind of arc of history that I learned about. I learned in great detail, I learned several of these topics, Second World War, First World War, and the Tudors, I think at least 3 times each in my school career. And as a boy, I start my last book with saying that as a boy I had a map of the world on my wall, and I used to stare at it every night. I'm a child of the Cold War. I'm a lot older than Akala. Disappointingly, it's really traumatic getting old. But when I was a boy growing up, I would have that history that I just showed you, that most people here had that in their schools today. I think my niece, who's 9, is here somewhere in the audience. That's exactly what she's going to be learning. But I'd come home and I'd watch John Craven's Newsround, for those of you old enough to remember the lovely John Craven's Newsround, and I would see Soviet missiles being put in Eastern Germany. I saw the windows of the Iranian embassy in London being blown out by the SAS storming it. I saw the trauma of what we called Vietnamese boat people, or the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, and apartheid in South Africa, and I couldn't ever understand why those always led the news, but were never mentioned once in class. And I used to stare at my map on the wall. First thing I do when I well, actually I'm a little bit older now, first thing I do, I check if I'm going to get a meal on the plane or if I have to pay for it. But one of the first things I still love doing is flicking to the back of the brochure on the plane and seeing the airline routes. Unfortunately, airlines are now so global, and my eyes are no good. It's quite hard to see what's what. But I love staring at maps. And as a boy, I used to memorize the names of capital cities and of the oceans and the deserts and so on. And it seemed to me that the world was quite big, and I was only learning about quite a small part of it. I only ever learned really about the story of Europe. And in fact, that, I suppose, is not surprising in some ways. You find out about your own neighborhood wherever you grow up. You learn about your neighbors, you learn about who's having problems with their marriages, who beats their children, who's nice to their children, or whatever the problems are. You learn about that. That's completely right. But it seemed to me, even then, in a global world where global news and global events, we were all linked, it seemed to me completely incomprehensible that I didn't learn about who these people were trying to, in some cases, kill us. I couldn't understand why people wanted to hijack airliners in the Middle East, or who Yasser Arafat was, why he was constantly on the news. So I wanted to learn about other parts of the world, and I also wanted to understand how history had been edited to give us that glossy vision that we never thought it was worthwhile studying other people's pasts. And as I got a bit older, I started to realize actually it's not really the history of Europe that we focus on, because most people, I'm sure you're a very eloquent, articulate, distinguished audience, most people can't name the greatest poet in Hungarian history, or they can't mention what's the most important battle in the history of Sweden, or who's important in Greek history, or who's a great Greek writer after Aristotle. In fact, even Eastern Europe we've got no clue about. We don't pay any attention at all. So the history I really learnt about was about Western Europe, these countries that 100 years ago all had empires, including Belgium. Tiny little Belgium had an empire. We learnt about how history looks from the perspective of, I suppose, the winners who write history. That's a hackneyed phrase. It's not surprising in lots of ways, but it creates a version of the past that in some ways is a little bit self-serving. It's distorting and perhaps in some ways misleading, unfair, and, well, maybe even wrong. Because it doesn't explain how other people fit in. It doesn't explain what happened before Europe got going. And as a young boy, I used to love Alexander the Great. He was about half my age when he died, having conquered the whole world. I've had a book that did okay. It's not quite the same, although again, you've got to be the right age to even know what I'm talking about. As a boy growing up, we didn't have Sky Sports, it didn't exist. If you out of season, the best you could do if you liked games and sports was Crown Green bowls and darts. And snooker, actually. But darts, I remember Sid Wavell, who was the great darts commentator, was commentating the World Darts Championship in the 1980s when Eric Bristow won the darts championship. Darts, for those of you all know who darts is, right? You throw the little arrow. And Eric Bristow, I think, became world champion when he was 29 or something. And Sid Wavell, who was a great classicist, he'd studied classics at university, loved his classical texts, he commented and said, Alexander the Great conquered the world when he was 33, and he wept salt tears when he reached the Indus Valley. That's my attempt at a Geordie accent. Bristow's only 29. So, but it even occurred to me as a boy that Alexander the Great really wasn't interested in those parts of the world that I was being taught about, south of France, Germany, Italy. Alexander the Great wanted to go east, along these connections that have been known for the last 120 years or so as the Silk Roads. It's a slightly clumsy term in lots of ways because there is no motorway. My publisher in India is running an online competition saying, where did the Silk Road start and where did it finish? And I've had to hold off replying, saying that's not how it worked, because it suggests there's one road. In fact, it's just these networks of how people connected with each other. Most connections are local, it's town to town, village to village, but there are some things and some people who travel long distances, things that are expensive, as we know, are the things that we treasure most. When you lose an earring, it's valuable. You spend time looking for it. If you lose a piece of paper, that's your receipts. It's just too bad. So the things that are expensive and elite, which are unusual, get written about by writers. They get commented on a lot, and sometimes they get preserved. But Alexander the Great turned eastwards. What mattered in the ancient world lay in the east. And that's because these regions, these peoples, these civilizations is where we all began. It's where the first laws were ever made. It's where all our religions come from on the map behind me. This is where Judaism comes from. It's where Christianity comes from. There's a wonderful, you can see it on YouTube, a senator in Texas when they're trying to discuss whether bilingual teaching should happen, whether kids in Texas should have lessons in Spanish and in English, because there's a large Hispanic population in Texas. And a Texan senator stands up. You can imagine the type, quite well-fed, really red, hot day, pink in the face, pointing his finger very angrily, saying, if the English language was good enough for our Lord Jesus Christ, it's good enough for the senators, for the people of Texas. But this is also where Buddhism comes from, where Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, all of our great religions, and most of the time, people involved in religion, despite what some people will tell you, they don't kill each other. People who have different views about God or about support a different football team or wear different kind of clothes, they tend not to kill each other. People kill each other when there's money and power involved. And in fact, most of the time, what's more interesting is to see how do these religions offer similar answers to similar questions. What happens when we die? Why did somebody die young? Why was my friend run over crossing the road? Why should I be a good citizen? Why should I have one wife or 4 wives, whatever it might be? Always trying to answer very similar kinds of questions. And so, of course, there's a lot of correspondence between these religions. And looking at how we're connected seemed much more interesting to me. I mean, in fact, the history we learn tends to be about breakdowns. They tend to be about warfare. They tend to be about empire. They tend to be about aggressive acts. Whereas I'd have thought there's something to be said for trying to understand which states worked in history. So one of the things I teach at my university is the history of the Byzantine Empire that lasted for 1,000 years. And if you want to, it's quite fun actually, on Google Alerts, you can key in whatever term to search. I get the word Byzantine every time it's quoted in Parliament. And it's quoted almost every day. I don't know why, but mainly by Conservative MPs, usually because they're trying to show off, because it's quite any word with the letter Z and the letter Y in it is a lot of points in Scrabble and makes you sound clever. And they use this word as a highly negative, legislation is Byzantine, the European Union is Byzantine, things are Byzantine, rather than saying, we didn't manage 45 years in the EU. The Byzantine Empire lasted for a millennium, 1,000 years. So maybe they did a few things right. Maybe there are things we could learn from stability. But anyway, that's a different story. But anyway, this focus of trying to look at history to the east is what's interesting. And the story of the West, the story of Europe, really only starts quite recently. Europe becomes the center of global power after about the year 1500, after Columbus and those who follow him cross the Atlantic. He's trying, by the way, not to see if the world is flat or see what's out there. He's trying to find a way to get traders to India and China by sailing westwards. He was convinced that the world must be round and that therefore, if he kept on going, he'd reach China. So he took with him interpreters who could speak languages or that he thought he'd be able to communicate in. And in fact, when he arrived in the Caribbean and came back, he swore blind to his patrons, the King and Queen of Castile and Aragon, that he'd found China. He'd found the way to the Great Khan. He wasn't quite sure where he lived, but he was pretty sure he was somewhere nearby. Almost exactly the same time as Columbus did that, Vasco da Gama, the great Portuguese sailor, went around the southern tip of Africa and found ways of getting to Asia, to India, South Asia, and then to the Spice Islands and to China by sea. And suddenly, as you can see from the map behind me, Europe was the central point of the world's continents. Before then, Europe had been at the wrong end of town, the wrong end of the Silk Roads. And here it is in Europe. It's still the case today, actually, we don't produce very much. We don't have a great deal of gold, almost none, bits of silver here and there if you work hard, a bit of tin, a bit of oil in the North Sea, but empires grow by controlling resources. Civilizations grow by becoming rich. And Europe's great advantage was that by mastering the oceans, by mastering the fact that we killed each other all the time in Europe, there wasn't a single decade between 1350 and 1950 that didn't involve a war in Europe or between European powers, not one decade. So, you can see why the EU got given the Nobel Peace Prize about 10 years ago, because it's a profound achievement that we've somehow managed to just argue with each other and throw insults rather than do the usual. But our technological advantage when it came to warfare allowed Europe to dominate the world. And it did so quite effectively if you were European, not particularly nicely if you're not European, where the source of extraction of what empires do is they take commodities, they take people, they take ideas, and they funnel them back to the center. It was the European age from 1500, 1550, 1600, until quite recently. But over the last 100 years, that center of gravity has started to shift in another direction. What happened when Europe became rich is we started to reinvent that past. So we started to produce statues, like here by Canova, breathtakingly beautiful. You cry when you see it in real life, well, almost. But to sort of say, well, we are connected to ancient Rome. That's why kids learn about the Roman Empire. We're their heirs. We have some kind of connection to this is why you look around this hall, you see this kind of classical architecture. But the Greeks really didn't come here. And the Romans who came to Britain, if you want to see just how happy they were, go and look at the letters from Vindolanda, and none of them are saying this is the best posting that they could possibly go to, and they had a daylight today, it gets dark at 4 o'clock and it's raining. You know, in a pre-Wi-Fi age, even I would find it hard to kill time. But so we edited the past. We start to create statues in our art that mimicked things that happened 1,500 years earlier, even though there was no connection with us at all. So here, Alexander the Great on one side, and Napoleon, and the Duke of Wellington on the other. There's no reason to have these kind of similarities. No reason why buildings in Berlin or Washington or Sydney should look like Greek and Roman temples. It's about the way that Europe edited and created a past which is not unusual. All societies do that. They create a world that looks familiar. In our case, that has produced profound distortions. And I don't mean to, these are colleagues and friends of mine who write these books, so I'm not trying to be personal, but you have books written about medieval Christianity that do not mention the fact that there was a giant, the biggest cathedral in the world for 1,000 years was in Constantinople in Byzantium. They don't mention the fact that there was a church with bishops all the way across Asia and North Africa. They don't mention that the medieval church or that pilgrimage is anything other than a Christian process. And in fact, pilgrimage for Jains, for Hindus, for Buddhists, for Muslims, for Jews, pilgrimage is something unique that's shared by all religions, of the process of trying to reach something, both physically and sometimes mentally too. You find books about medieval thinkers that do not mention a single scholar, scientist, writer, philosopher who wasn't writing in Latin or Greek. When we think about classics, there's no space for Sanskrit, there's no space for Chinese, there's no space for any African text at all. No space at all for anybody in this insistent story that good ideas come from the West. And so in Oxford, for example, my university, we have a fantastic museum, and it has the 27 most important scientists around the wall. On the wall, statues of them. And they're all names that you'll know: Darwin, Euclid, and Pythagoras, and so on. There's not a single scientist from the great Arab Empire, no one from the Indic world, from South Asia, even though words like algorithms and algebra might suggest that there were contributions made to the world of science from outside our continent. And of course, that is a problem in the present day. I'm going to talk about the present and the future now, because when we conceptualize the present, we're using the past to frame that. We're using the past, and I know that by statistics, 48% of you will think one thing and 52% will think something different. But you know, I'm not here to be, maybe we could get political, but when we think about the past, we are convinced that there is something called normal, or there is a way in which we can lead the world. Theresa May, her first press statement after she became Prime Minister, and you remember the trauma of Brexit, the trauma of the Prime Minister resigning, the trauma of a leadership campaign where Boris Johnson was knifed in the back, or no, the front by Michael Gove, where the sort of the chaos of what we look like globally. And Theresa May, her first press statement said, I'm looking forward to leading this country and to show that Britain could be a global leader. And of all the things we could be trying to do right now, we've got problems traumatic problems to deal with in the UK. Being a leader is not one of them. Anybody who has been a leader knows that you've got to have things in order before you try to lead by example, particularly with what's going on not very far away from here. So the story of where what we're going through now, in fact, the bus, a sort of symbol of chaos and trauma, of discussions and so on, is partly to do with the fact that world around us is changing very fast. And people who voted for Brexit, people who voted for Trump, are not necessarily wrong in their sense that things aren't going in our direction. Over the last 28 years, 800 million people in China have come out from underneath the poverty line. 800 million. The pace of change in India, in Russia, I mean, it wouldn't cross my mind growing up that Chelsea would spend £50 million on one player who turns out to be not very good, Fernando Torres. I'm sorry if you're here in the audience. Or that the owner would be a Russian. It would never cross my mind that the Abu Dhabi government would own Manchester City. It would never cross anybody's mind that property prices all over the world were being pushed up by Russian owners. When I was a boy, if you heard Russian, you knew that you were in trouble. They must be surrounded by spies. But the idea that the richest people are the Russians, or the fact that the richest people buying luxury goods are from China or the Middle East, it's extraordinary. When I get my train back to Oxford tonight, the announcement is made in English, and then in Arabic, and then in Chinese. Right? This is the world that we're changing in, and it's very hard to adapt to change when things don't seem to be going the right direction. And so that is why there is a rise of visions of trying to explain that, well, we can turn the clock back, but trying to say we should shut the gates, we must be able to stop time. We must be able to find a way where we can put ourselves first. And we see that in Trump as well. We see that sense that jobs have been lost from the developed economies, and the great wealth that has been created in the last 30 years has been in other economies, particularly in Asia, particularly in the East. And what's interesting about the new Silk Roads that are being formed is the discussion is not about barriers, it's not about walls, it's about new connections being made. This Astana, the capital of Kazakhstan, is a younger city than Google, right? And Google was made, I think, the year before, it was founded a couple of years before I got married. And I've been married for, my wife's been married, I was going to say for a long time, but that's a good thing. I love my wife, I love being married to her. I'm sleeping on my own tonight. I've been married for a long time. So that shows that the pace of change, the capital city where these amazing monuments. This is the airport in Baku. That's not what Gatwick looked like when I flew in last week. Or Ashgabat in Turkmenistan. You'll see there are no cars on the road. There's a crazy dictator there. Black cars have been banned. He has a statue of himself that rotates to face the sun and so on. Dubai, again, has risen from the sands to build the biggest building and tallest buildings in the world. Or Bangalore, the center of the Indian IT industry. These changes are profound and huge. This is Iran. This is a building that was sold for $30 million a couple of years ago. These are not countries that we need to feel sorry for, or that they're people who we should be trying to work out who they are, how to study their histories. And part of it is to do with China and the Belt and Road Initiative. China are building new Silk Roads, investing. We discuss it a lot about exactly how much, but certainly hundreds of billions of dollars on new infrastructure investments across all of Asia, building railways, roads, power plants, etc. And that's a very complicated story about why they're doing it, where they're doing it, how they're doing it. What will the consequences be? Lots of very negative ones and some very positive ones. But in the meantime, our vision for what the future looks like, the Northern Powerhouse, if you look on the Northern Powerhouse website, the most important thing that's been done since the Northern Powerhouse was announced a year before China has committed hundreds of billions of dollars, has been the opening of the south face of Leeds train station. And the most recent news is that there are 7 new posters at Manchester Airport. Okay, so we are standing still while this new world forms. This new world of connections of people who don't necessarily have natural interests, but they do share a common past of those connectivities, those ways in which cultures, languages, religions have all melted into a pot together, generally quite peacefully over the course of the last 2,000 or 3,000 years. There are lots of different maps you can have of China showing how its ability to build new corridors and help the world in what they call a win-win scenario is trying to change the world. These train lines, you can now go from Yiwu, the Christmas capital of the world, they make all those baubles you'll find on your Christmas trees, which now reaches a depot outside Barking. And perhaps it's striking that those wagons that come here full go back at least half empty or more, because there's not much that we make here. They're very keen on baby milk made in Britain. There have been baby milk scandals and so on, and luxury goods, but not a great deal else. In the meantime, we see proper problems going on in the world. Iran is back under sanctions led by the US, put in place 2 weeks ago. Those of you who read and are medics will know that the primary shortage at the moment for Iran is that they are unable to get hold of pharmaceuticals and drugs. When the US put sanctions on Iraq in the same way in the early 90s, the Lancet estimated that 400,000 children died of malnutrition or related diseases. When you put sanctions on, they tend to fortify and strengthen the conservative military elites at the top, and they tend to punish those at the bottom. So the talk is of America trying to help the Iranian people overthrow their masters. Actually, it'll achieve something very different. In the meantime, we see also China on the move with the kind of headlines behind that suggest that while we fiddle and talk about Brexit, other things that are more important are going on. And we don't pay any attention to these people's histories, let alone to their presents and to their futures. The kinds of headlines that you see, each on their own individually, should make you splutter on your porridge or your avocado and whatever it is, the rye bread, healthy option with chili flakes on the top. It's not what I have. They've stopped making ricicles. I don't quite know why. Too much sugar. We start to see this world that looks very unfamiliar and in many ways very threatening. And some of the quotes on the wall behind from the last couple of months say things about the readiness for war, right? And these aren't localized individual problems that we're immune from because there's a channel that separates us from Europe. We are very closely linked to global supply chains in this country, as we know through the Brexit story. In fact, China, we have a greater exposure to the Chinese economy in Britain and the Chinese global supply chains than the US, Japan, the European Union, and South Korea combined. Any pressure on China's economy through US sanctions directly targets us. You'll have seen last night that President Trump said this is a terrible deal for the EU deal that's been proposed. It's a terrible deal for Britain, and the US won't do a trade deal separately with the United Kingdom. This stuff matters for us at a time where we're talking about will we have lorries backed up on the M20 and so on. So we have a world emerging in front of us quickly of new connections, ambitious imperial powers trying to find ways of cooperating together. The connections between Turkey, Russia, Iran, and China, very complicated. These are competitor powers, but all of them have one common thing linking them today, which is that they all say that they are forces of stability. Right? And that comes as a bit of a shock to those who follow what the Russians do in Salisbury or to the elections. That comes as a bit of a shock when you see what the Turkey does in northern Iraq and so on, where it's projecting a very specific idea of what it thinks Turkey's future will be. Likewise with Iran fighting proxy wars in the Middle East and in Yemen, and also China too. Hugely disruptive in lots of ways, but reminding everybody that the people who pull out of agreements are the United States. The people who pull out of the agreements are countries in Europe. The people who refuse to get along are peoples of the West. And that this is a time where that center of gravity shifting backwards is moving towards where it has always lain. And our future will be shaped by the decisions that get made, not in Brussels or Madrid or London, important though they are, right, for us and globally too. We're still an important global economy, but profoundly important are those. And that's just to show the picture of the sort of flashpoints in the world today, and where they mirror the Silk Roads. And Iraq, we know that. We know Libya and Egypt, and the Arab Spring. We know the Middle East and Israel and so on. That's not even in the news anymore. There's Yemen. We see the potential for military action against Iran. Iranian ships patrolling the Gulf, trying to stop American naval military vessels. There's interventions in Ukraine on Sunday night, where at midnight the cabinet in Kiev met to impose a state of martial law in the country of Ukraine, where Russia has been highly aggressive over the last 5 years, and again this weekend, impounding 3 Ukrainian naval vessels that the Ukrainian government has called an act of war. Afghanistan, despite the resources that are poured in, has been a drain of human life locally, and of the troops that have gone in to try to make the best they can, and of the associated problems that there doesn't seem to be any end in sight. We see the spillover of fundamentalism and actually not people wanting power and wanting money into countries neighboring in Central Asia, very high levels of radicalization, and some of these countries which have resources that are mind-bogglingly wealthy. So Turkmenistan, a country which no one can put on a map, has the 4th largest gas reserves in the world, and it's more or less bankrupt as a state. Lots of different reasons why that might be. India and Pakistan, a very tense relationship. The last 2 years, about as bad the relationship has been since a partition in the 1940s. Last summer, while we were watching, this summer was the World Cup. Last summer, when we were busy doing one thing or another, watching Trump's Twitter feed, there was military confrontation between Chinese and Indian soldiers at the border of these two countries. Their commanding officers told their men to lay down their weapons, so it was a fist fight. But this is the world that's real around us today. Indian and Chinese vessels firing warning shots at each other in the Indian Ocean, and a huge amount of competition in the Maldives and Sri Lanka about the vision for whose sea is where. We then have the South China Sea, North Korea, and so on. It's no coincidence that these flashpoints all exist along what we roughly call the Silk Roads, those connections. And that new world that's being born is one that is competitive, it's disruptive, it offers lots of opportunities for cooperation, it offers a very different way to examine the global present and the global future. And there's the sort of the Silk Road as it gets drawn by tourist company. I go with a felt tip pen to add an S, because the man who came up with this term insisted that it should be plural, the Silk Roads. But this world which we live in is very unfamiliar. We spent no time thinking about it. I think in today's world, we spend very little time thinking about it today because we have other things we're worried about. We're looking at ourselves in the mirror, worrying about Brexit and things like that. But the world of today, not the world of tomorrow, the world of today is already being shaped by these countries for good and for bad. This is where our opportunities lie. This is where our challenges lie. And that's why, if you read my book, hopefully you'll get a sense of why that's the case. Thank you very much.
Fascinating. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How you lot doing? That was absolutely rubbish. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How you doing?
I thought you meant...
There we go, better.
God, I thought you meant my talk. Absolutely rubbish.
No.
Their reaction, sorry.
No, I was saying after something so interesting. So, at the beginning of the book, you say we're living through a change that is as epochal, as globe-shifting, as important as that ushered in by Columbus and Vasco da Gama and the others. You believe that? And if so, why?
Well, I think you start always with resources, who controls them, where they are, and what's necessary. So in today's world, whether we like it or not, fossil fuels drive all of our energy needs, and 75% of the world's fossil fuels lie east of Istanbul. So what happens in Saudi Arabia, what happens in Iran, in Russia, the wealth that flows in those directions, as our economies grow, they become more and more important. In the new world that we're heading towards, where we're all clean energy and so on, the rare earths that we need to make our batteries work and so on, they're all 95% of global resources are in China or Mongolia or Central Asia. There's almost nothing anywhere else. Cobalt in West Africa, and guess what? China's hugely active across the continent of Africa, building roads, hospitals, and so on and so forth. And so I think that the East and Asia Asia's complicated. It's a complicated term, right? Like Africa is a complicated term. What unity there really is between individual regions and countries. But having said that, these countries east of Istanbul, east of Turkey, haven't won at our expense. In fact, they've grown because in harmony with us, because we've traded. We start to buy my jeans made in Bangladesh, my Italian jacket, which I thought would be made in Italy, in fact made in India. It's helped us keep our prices down. It's helped our economies grow too. But the great wealth creation has been particularly in China, but also in India and in Southeast Asia, where it's been South Korea as well, an economic miracle over the last 30, 40 years. And anybody who's traveled there, who goes on the air, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the idea that you go on Emirates or Qatar Airlines or Etihad, where you get like gold belt buckles, that is a result of the fact that if you control resources and you control the networks, then you're able to call the shots. And today we can see that one manifestation is much more aggressive behavior by some of these states. So you'll have seen about the young British academic who was put in prison and jail for life. The UAE eventually gave him a pardon, but their reaction was, we don't really care what you tell us. We followed our processes and so on. Or in Canada, the Canadian foreign minister a couple of months ago rather, tweeted out saying Saudi Arabia is not behaving well with the murder of a journalist, and that day the Crown Prince said, right, all Saudi students studying Canadian universities, you should come home. And suddenly that's $250 million worth of university revenues gone. And these countries, they feel they're very muscular, they're starting to behave to the manner born because they have got cash, they've got resources, and they have a fundamental sense that the world is theirs to inherit. And that can be very positive, that energy, that sense that tomorrow is going to be better than today. And you invest in different ways, you educate in different ways. And I think here in the West, Theresa May, interestingly, in her letter at the weekend, she said, I firmly believe Britain's best days lie ahead of us. And I know we're not here to talk about empire and its problems and what that means for other places that were colonized, but Britain had quite a good run for 200 or 300 years. They did pretty well from empires from the Caribbean, from Africa, from Asia, and so on. The idea that we think that we're going to do better than that suggests that maybe we should look at history in a slightly different way.
Do you wonder, though, there's a danger if we determine what is better or worse by imperial success,
sure,
that in and of itself can be problematic. What I mean by that, you look at Britain today, and Britain has in many ways been a very successful multi-ethnic country, and we've often problematized that. But surely British Indians, British Ghanaians, British Jamaicans are an asset to the economy if we really wish to have a productive relationship with our former colonies rather than one based on domination. And I wonder sometimes a lot of the fear in Britain is based in this idea of imperial decline, of defining our identity and our ability to dominate others rather than work with others. Do you think that's a little
No, I think that's exactly right. I think all of us realize that pluralism and multiple voices allows you to have a chance to listen to, like music. The more influences you have, the better. How can it be possibly the other way around? And in fact, what's striking about this new world that's rising is it's specifically unfree. It's specifically intolerant. All these countries, including places like India, the biggest democracy in the world, the jailing of journalists, the harassment that the media have in all these countries is not just bad, it's bad and getting worse. right? So in fact, those moral, we're going in two different directions where we try, with all, exactly like you say, for all the problems and all that, actually we do quite a good job in being integral. We could do much better, we could still do more, but we should be proud of our achievement, and we should explain to other countries, that's one legacy that we can have, to say, this has been our journey, this is what happened when we were autocratic and we excluded people, and actually since then, this is why our society is vibrant and so on. But I think we have forgotten our own place in the scheme of things, and perhaps perhaps there are pressures now in Europe against the idea that we should be open and plural. You see that with the rise of a lot of voices across mainland Europe. It's not quite so bad here in Britain, but there's no monopoly on tolerance. There's no monopoly on the fact that because we're decent people, we get on with it. Across the Channel in the Second World War, the French aren't bad people, but when they were in the right conditions, they wrote 55 million letters of denunciation about each other to the German authorities in the space of 5 years. They're still locked up, they're still classified, you still can't talk about it in France. And that's not because the French are bad, any more than it's not the Syrian people are bad people. In the right, or let's say the other way around, in the wrong circumstances, people do turn on their neighbors. People do start to make their identity something that they apply meaning to and allows them to be aggressive about. And that tends to happen in times of economic pressure. It tends to happen when you think that things are getting worse for you. It tends to think that we're better off making dramatic decisions. And like I said, I think that when you study it and think about history in terms of how do you build societies that do function well, that do last, that do incorporate, funnily enough, those lessons of the Byzantine Empire, the Ottomans, the Mongols, and so on, who are very successful at this stuff, they don't just not get taught, they get put to one side as being very negative examples.
Why do you think that is?
I think that there is a kind of there is a tyranny of using history as kind of good bedtime stories. And Henry VIII, you couldn't make that stuff up. That's that's mini-series after mini-series, and it's compulsive viewing, right? In the same way that you could make, Trump, that is box office. It's awful to watch, but it's completely compelling. What's he going to say this morning? All of his scientists in the United States have produced a climate change report. He says, I don't believe it. You couldn't make it up. And so I think some of it is to do with we confuse history with nice stories that make us feel good or feel bad, actually. The trauma of the First World War. But it's only very recently, as you know, we're talking about David Sugar and his work. It's only recently we've started to factor in, we write about the First World War. It's not just about the trenches. It's not just about the bravery of young men from Britain going over the top. It's about something much more global, about including many more people in those narratives. And of course, that's very important in allowing a society to become multicultural, because it allows people to understand their place in this process. So Ghanaian Brits, they recognize that their ancestors were involved in this process and weren't shut out of it. So historians have done quite a good job in helping explain that there are much more nuanced ways than the kind of old-fashioned story. But that's not the sort of way that people are looking at the past in other parts of the world.
So I've written some of my favorite factoids from the new book, congratulations, by the way, that I want to put to you, and I kind of want you to just extrapolate on them for the audience. Per capita income in Asia is going to see a 6-fold increase by 2050. What are the implications of that for the world, for us, for global power?
People who listen to your music and buy your album, buy my books, go on holidays. That's going to have an impact, and I'm probably going to. You haven't told me which the factoids are, but I'm going to take one probably away from you. Is that one of the things that I write in my book is how do you show what does this mean? How do you show this? And so I thought, okay, well, what are the things that I do? I travel quite a lot, and I love. I mean, I'm environmentally. I try as conscious as I can be, but I fly quite a bit, and I think about flights. It's great that you can fly. I've got to go to Amsterdam next week. It costs 40 quid return. It's cheaper. I'm not even joking. It's cheaper to fly to Amsterdam than to take the train return to Oxford.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, absolutely.
And so I thought, okay, are we in an age of permanent, long-term, cheap travel? And so I did a bit of research into the salaries of airline pilots. And current starting salary for airline pilots in China, if anybody can fly a 737, you're in the wrong room tonight, because the starting salary on Xiamen Air is cited at $750,000 a year. And the scope of the scale of air traffic that's going to rise, led by Turkey, Thailand, India, and China, almost completely driven by these countries, by people becoming richer and then wanting to fly for 40 quid to Bali for the weekend or to wherever it is, Dubai for the weekend. That will change hotels, right? When you walk into the lobby, they won't be playing the Beatles, or maybe they will be playing the Beatles, or Akala. Who knows what they'll be playing, but it'll be playing things that they like, so definitely you, right? But it'll start to be, you'll start to have Chinese food on the menu if you have a hotel that's filled with thousands or 90% occupancy of Chinese travelers. And so our airline businesses, the price of cost of tickets, when people become richer, that's not a threat to us, except for obviously it does start to drive prices up, but it starts to shape things like what does the decor of your hotel room look like, what's on the menu for supper, what music's playing in the lobby, what kind of luggage do people want to travel with, what's aspirational, and the world, from luxury down to non-luxury, is driven by what people who've got cash, how do they choose to spend their money. And in Asia, as people become richer, their tastes will start to shape what colors get used. So red, which is a lucky color in China, starts to become more visible than blue, which isn't a lucky color. And 888888 becomes, your number plate. If anyone's got one of those, that'll sell for a fortune. So it gets driven by the fact that global tastes are changing. And 100 years ago or 50 years ago, it was McDonald's and Diet Coke or Coke, and different tastes will come through too. And that's a challenge in places like China, where part of the reason our rhino and lion and tiger populations are declining is because of those appetites and spending power.
Yeah, as you already pointed out, Chinese tourists abroad already spend double what US tourists abroad spend. So we're sort of already in that direction. One of the things
if you go, which next time we do an event, we'll do it in Paris, and we'll go to Louis Vuitton on the Champs-Élysées. And if you go in there, I don't know what they do with us, but if you're Chinese, there's a floor limit. You're only allowed to spend €500,000 maximum. Because Chinese visitors, they come to the kit gets released in Paris 9 months before it gets released in Shanghai. So if you're rich and you're Chinese, you go there first, and then you can swan around back at home showing what you've got. Or if you're really sharp, which, that's trade, people go to Paris, buy it, and then take it back to China and sell it. So there are ways in which this already exists in ways that it's almost incomprehensible to understand.
Between 2007 and 2014, 10% of all London property money, all money spent on property in London, was Russian.
Yeah, that's right. And like I said, growing up in London, it never crossed my mind that the apartments that were selling for 50, 60, 100 million quid would have buyers from Russia. But I think that's the Soviet Union came to an end in a very particular way. And I was an undergraduate at that time, and I couldn't believe that the Soviet Union collapsed in the way that it did, a bit like apartheid, and not perfectly, but actually not bad, right? Could have been much worse. And people who were expecting violence and warfare and tanks to roll in, having seen Budapest in 1956, and I wasn't alive then, but the expectation that change would always be dramatic, it would always be fragile, it would involve people dying. Actually, these transitions have been very, very, they're almost under the radar, almost without anybody really noticing. And those changes, I think, are important.
Yeah, though with South Africa, do you not think, coming back to all of the points you made about sort of the way history is taught, there was a little bit of the good bedtime story with South Africa, in the sense that the wars that helped apartheid collapse were fought outside of South Africa, in Angola, in Mozambique. And because actually the evil Cubans were on the good side in that war and helped Mandela get out of prison, we've sort of deleted that episode from history in the way that we think about apartheid falling. The first country Nelson Mandela visited in the whole world was Cuba.
Yeah, and those stories that they require men and women of profound brilliance. And actually, to sum up Mandela, apart from his dignity in prison and so on and so forth, is that when he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize with F.W. de Klerk in 1994, all of Mandela's inner circle said that it would be wrong for him to share a stage with a man who'd been involved in it. And Mandela overruled and said, I'm going to do this because this is better, this is for the good of our people. And you need to have leaders who can step outside their body and do something that has that profound level of commitment to what history actually means. And that's quite hard. I mean, the truth is it's quite hard if you're a politician to do that. I suspect most people interviewed on the lawn outside Parliament don't have that moment of kind of, I'm going to do now something that I can feel the weight of history on my shoulders. And the people who talk about it like they do tend not to have the weight of history on their shoulders. But I think that cometh the man, cometh the hour, or cometh the hour, cometh the man or the woman. And I think that in this world that we see today, we see a lot of autocratic voices, a lot of autocratic tendencies, where there's an insistence that their way that they want to do things must work. But in Mandela's case, I think that what he did was crucially important for that transition to show that you can, despite everything that's happened, you've got to try and work out what tomorrow brings rather than dwell in the past.
I met Mandela, by the way. I just thought I'd drop that in. Genuinely, I'm not joking. I went to his house for dinner.
And?
Genuinely. No, my sister did a concert for his AIDS charity back in 2001. You know, you got to drop it in. You know.
Yeah, go on.
So he offered my sister one of his grandsons, actually. Genuinely. One of the funniest people I've met. Went to Robben Island, you know. Went to Mandela's house for dinner, as you do. Beyonce was there. Oprah was there. Genuinely, I'm not even making... You know, this is the kind of thing that happens in your life, where whenever you say it to people, it just sounds like you're making it up. This is why I've never talked about it for the last
When we do this
15
again,
years.
can I interview you?
No, I just thought I'd put it in there.
That's a good line. Okay, I can't touch that.
So there are more English-speaking Africans studying in China than the US or UK.
Yeah, so China understands, I mean, China's got lots of problems. So, you know, I could talk about human rights in China and, you know, the current re-education centers in Western China where, you know, which has been hugely complicated to try and understand why would there be such a international relations PR faux pas of locking up perhaps as many as 1 million Uyghurs or re-educating them. China's been very careful to try to build friendships. It's quite difficult to make friends. You need to learn how to trust people, you need to understand each other. China give, at the moment, more than 30,000 scholarships a year to African students to come and study in universities in China. China, despite the fact it talks quite a lot about its engagement with Africa, there was a Chinese admiral that sailed in the 1420s to Africa called Zheng He, and they make a big thing about that in China. China's experience of people of color is not particularly profound, so there's phases of casual and basic racism that the Chinese have to, not just to people of color, but actually to non-Chinese people, and even within Chinese minorities, is quite high. But you could take a different view, which is that over time, being exposed on both sides allows understandings to be built, allows mutual respect to be embedded, and it's not cheap to educate students from abroad, but the Chinese have taken a view that that they should bring in people from different parts of the world, that there should be Confucius institutes that allow kids to study and learn Chinese and learn about Chinese culture. Of course, the flip side is it's working out what it is that how China understands other people's societies and cultures too. And you know, I've been at events in China where somebody stood up and said there are only 4 civilizations in human history: China, Indian, Muslim, and Islamic, and Greek. And you kind of go, where does the West fit in there? And they go, well, the West has no civilization. You know, you oppress and whatever. And you kind of go, well, it's not quite that, but, you know, I'm a little bit down on Europe, don't get me wrong. But, you know, we've done a few good things too, you know. How about Mozart and whatever? They go, no Mozart. So, you know, I think it's about how do you, that's why I think this kind of writing of history, of trying to say how we're connected and who's winning at any point and how do you win, is important to try to learn some of those kind of lessons from the past. Mm-hmm.
So when the Chinese government dropped the one-child policy, the share price of all condom companies in China fell, and that of prams and baby toys soared.
Well, it all makes sense, right?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Right. China with a population of, I don't know, 1.3, 1.4 billion people, that's a lot of babies. That's a lot of, you know, with the one-child policy, it wasn't implied absolutely, you know, to the point. But China, in fact, now is getting rid even of the two-child policy because there's a real demographic problem. But, you know, it shows that these big swings, I mean, it's like quantum physics. You know, a small or butterfly wings, you know, flaps here, and suddenly the shares of stroller companies goes through the roof. Because, of course, if you're going to suddenly have 10, 20% more kids being born in a year, that's another, whatever, it's 500,000, million more children. They all need what they need, and particularly if a population is becoming richer, then so much the better. So I think that shows the scale of what's going on. So along the sort of modern Silk Roads, from the Mediterranean to the Pacific Ocean, that's where 4.5 to 5 billion people live. That's 65% of the world's population. So when people living there become richer, or they starve, or they have food shortages or water shortages, that has a massive concertina effect, because the scale of what we're talking about isn't small population sizes where shocks can be absorbed, and big presents real fragilities too when things go wrong. So I love looking at that again, trying to explain what is the impact of all of this. So I had a look at some of the research on condoms and whatever, which luckily no one caught me trying to look at in the library in university. Condom sales in China. So my Google search record will look slightly strange. But you know, I think it's trying to make this understandable to, you know, the layperson.
Speaking of sort of interesting trivialities, there was a passage in the book about the relationship between baby powder and global world power. Can you expand on that sort of dilemma a little bit?
Yeah, so talcum powder. When I was young, everybody had talcum powder, and does people know what talcum powder is? Right? We use talcum powder is the softest powder known to mankind, right? And it's found, like lapis and like gold, almost exclusively in Afghanistan. And ISIS-K, which is sort of the Central Asian variant of ISIS-Daesh, have been highly active in trying to work out what any mafia group, any terrorist organization would want to do, which is you can give as many talks as you like about how great it is to blow yourself up, but the way to really take power is to have cash and have resources, because if you've got cash, you can buy weapons, you can buy kits, you can buy shoulder-to-air missile launchers, you can buy people's cooperation. You can bribe them, you can pay tributes, you can bring people in. So ISIS-K have been very effective in trying to work out what assets produce cash. And one of the things they've targeted are the talcum mines in Afghanistan. And that brings them estimates around about, Global Witness did the work on this, somewhere between $20 and $30 million a year minimum. And that's quite a lot of cash. And actually these tribal leaders or these militant leaders, they tend to talk a bit like Trump, talks in one way, and actually you've got to look at what their actions are. So they're very highly motivated in trying to intimidate the local population to pay them more cash, that then gives them more money. And then I suspect, and I haven't been to the tribal areas of eastern Afghanistan, I expect there are in those caves absolutely giant TVs where people are watching the football, right? Because if you're minted, that's what you want to do. So talcum powder is all connected. Every time I put in my book, when you powder a baby's bottom in Lagos or Wuhan or London or wherever it is, that powder has come from probably ISIS-controlled territories, shipped out through Pakistan through legal or illegal means, but is connected a bit like the global drugs trade and supply. We don't think. I mean, I shouldn't say we. When people in some parts of London are big on the drugs, they don't connect that somehow is linked directly to global suffering. And you think, well, it's just one hit or it's one this or one that. But in a globalized, interconnected world, it's important as a citizen to understand that that's what you're doing. And maybe you choose to turn a blind eye and think, to hell with it, let people suffer. It's not really anything to do with me. I'm just a consumer. But actually, the reality is to be informed and to be a good citizen requires some understanding of these connections.
Speaking of football, you raised football there. One of the things that really fascinated me in the book, I did not know the first recorded game of football, obviously it wasn't like the modern game necessarily, was in Han, China.
Yeah.
I bet that's going to burst a lot of people's bubbles. No?
And that's not, historians quite often get accused of rewriting the past, right? That's the FIFA official story, by the way. So, there's a picture of a Sung dynasty emperor in the 10th century playing keepy-uppy. So there's a silk of him balancing the ball on his foot, and there's a net in the background. And, that's why one of the things that China's trying to do is to get its national football team to be really good. And China's got lots of things going for it, but they're really not very good at football at all. But Inter Milan is owned by Chinese. AC Milan was owned by a Chinese owner until a few months ago when his credit score went through the floor. But China's been very active in trying to promote the idea of football. And in fact, under 23 players in the last 2 months have been taken away from their teams in China. I'm a Chelsea fan. One of the Chelsea players was bought in China. Apparently, it's paid $30 million a year. They're playing for Shanghai. But the young players under 23 have been taken away from their teams. They've been sent to military training camps, had their heads completely shaved, and they've been told they've got to be able to nutmeg and do all the tricks to get them to train harder and harder to make them better. It's a real centerpiece of what the future China will look like. So that's why those of you who remember will know that when President Xi came here, he went to have a pint of ale with David Cameron, who used to be Prime Minister in this country, for those who don't remember. And they went up to Manchester City and I think met all the players there, and a lot of resources going into trying to get Chinese football to go back to the so-called Chinese glory days. So I say in my book, when we sing "Football's Coming Home," we think in England that because we wrote the rules down, that we have a monopoly on football, and it is pretty good, our Premier League, don't get me wrong, but China have first dibs according to FIFA.
One of your former colleagues at Oxford, Felipe Fernandez-Armesto, one of my favorite historians, I read in his book, Millennium, I believe it was, that golf is also from China.
You'll have to do an event with him.
I didn't know. I was just like, and apparently it's always been a game for rich people.
Well, games are for rich people, right? And funny enough, games have always been the same way. So if you're rich in any society, hunting is what you do, right? If you're a ruler of a state in Africa or Central America, whatever, you go and hunt, and you go and hunt rare animals. And the rarer and the more valuable, the better. So, games are what you do if you don't have to work for a living. So, that's why, I guess, golf, football, Scrabble, whatever it is, that's the Romans had a word called otium. We talked about it off stage. I said, I can't wait to retire. And then when you've got time on your hands, you can enjoy yourself. And enjoying yourself, I'm not having a great time, don't get me wrong. But but that moment of otium, that period where you can just relax, we all get that for a couple of weeks in the summer, where you kick back, you float in the pool, or do whatever it is you do, climb. I don't understand people who go climbing in the holidays, but anyway, we've all been made different. But I think that process of relaxing, rich people always have had very similar ways of finding time. So golf, I'll look that up though.
Mm-hmm. And on the habits of rich people, the fastest growing retail market in the world, we could put this out here, and how many people do you think would guess it? I'd guess close to 0.
I would guess close to 0, yeah.
Does anyone want to throw a guess out? The fastest growing retail market, national retail market in the world is which country? Anyone just want to shout out random?
It's like school, not even a guess.
Don't be scared, Nigeria's not a bad guess, it isn't Nigeria. India's not a bad guess, it isn't India, it isn't Saudi Arabia. Kenya, it's not Kenya. Who said Pakistan? There we go. Put your hand up. Yeah. Well done, whoever said Pakistan.
Must have read the book. Definitely read the book.
Definitely read the book. But things like this, and even though you didn't mention it necessarily in the book, but just the general, our lack of understanding of where other countries are at. I read somewhere that about 70% of science and engineering students in Iran are women. A few years ago, one of the things I talk about at the end of Natives, middle-aged Indian aunties in their saris, are putting rockets on Mars for 10% of the cost that NASA can put rockets on Mars. How equipped do you think we are to understand this future of the world that you talk about?
Well, on the back of my presentation, I think not very. We don't learn these languages, we don't think about their histories, we don't listen to their music. We are, I think, very disconnected. And also, we have a sort of default position, which is that people should become more like us. So when I travel to other parts of the world, increasingly, they're very clever. I'm in the academic world, you get very clever people commenting like you. It sounds like I've got that all wrong, doesn't it? When I'm with my scholars, with guys with long, big beards talking about history, they say, okay, you say you should be like you, but does that include the Holocaust? When you say we should be like you, does that include how you treated women? And women in Azerbaijan or Uzbekistan got the vote before they did in Britain. So increasingly, when they reflect on our history, they say, okay, so our cities, which were very cosmopolitan and had big minorities of Jews, of Hindus, of Christians, or whatever.
For millennia,
we look back at what European cities looked like, and Venice had a ghetto filled with the Jews and forced into sort of terrible conditions and having to live essentially on their own, or how you treated the Protestants or the Catholics. Again, I still don't even understand exactly what the argument was all about with all of that. When you create those kind of differences in other parts of the world, there's increasingly a line saying, you take the good bits when you say we should be like you, open, plural, successful, cosmopolitan, like you're saying about we do well in Britain, but you sort of forget about the bits that don't sort of suit you, because you're going to go, well, it was Hitler. We don't talk about anti-Semitism in other parts of Europe at the same time, or let alone, not just in the countries that were occupied by the Germans, the ways in which people like Churchill talked about people in the Middle East or in India or in Africa, and then we have to sort of apologize and go, it's not really fair because it was just a product of his time. Everybody talked like that at polite dinner parties, and so you shouldn't really judge him by it. And I think we're not very well equipped to deal with it, because we not only don't understand them, we don't understand how other people look back at us, and that's about their past, about the past as much as it is about looking at us in the present.
And do you think it's also partly, the great Korean economist Ha-Din Chang looks at this a lot, where we talk about how democratic we are now, but we forget that at the same stage of development that most countries in the global south or elsewhere in the world were, we were far less democratic than they are today. And so in some senses, even though many of these countries have tremendous abuses, they're far ahead of where we were when we were at the same economic stage, if they're judged by the standards of our own history.
Yeah, look, I think that's true to a point. I mean, if you ask me where I'd like to live, I'm here, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And there are not necessarily many places in the world, actually, that I'd rather be than here in Britain or in Europe. So there is a kind of magnetism about what we do. I think that when we think about the idea that other people are ahead of us in the curve, and that it's easy to turn a blind eye to the fact we persecute. But to give a good example of how crazy we are in this country. We have a Secretary of State for Industry and Trade called Liam Fox, who said last week, we shouldn't trade with the European Union, which is a socialistic, opaque, corrupt institution. So I can't wait. In the next sentence, he literally said, Britain should do a free trade deal with China. Right, where the economy is closed, there's no Western investment. Trump is putting tariffs and sanctions on to try to force China to open up, and China keeps saying they're going to, and then don't. So I think that we've got to line up the pieces fairly and correctly. We need to understand the dignity of other people's past, how they look at them, how they look at what's going on, and to see what role we play in the future. But it's difficult when you feel that you're losing position. It's difficult when you feel other people are becoming wealthier and more successful. It's hard to deal with. I was in France recently. And somebody stood up and said, I find the French terrible, the French, there you go, I could have said that. So I find the Chinese terribly arrogant. So I said, okay, that's an observation. Do you have a question? He goes, do you find the French?
That's what you call Freudian slip, ladies and gentlemen.
Sorry. Do you find the Chinese very arrogant? So I said, I imagine if I was in West Africa or in South Asia in 17 or 1800, and people turned up in their ship wearing wigs and saying, let's play a game of cricket, and then, by the way, this is what I've got news for you, I'd have found outsiders arrogant too. It's very difficult to deal with the fact that the world has changed. Very difficult when you can't afford to get on the ladder to find out that some Russian guy spent $100 million on a house. It's very hard to deal with the fact that other people seem to have life easier for them. And one of the kind of truisms that we have about countries to the east is that it's all lazy, corrupt, easy living. We don't think that they have the people work. Everyone who makes money must be stealing it, and that's normally not the case. There are some obvious exceptions to that. But
and obviously, no one has ever stolen anything in British history.
Well, don't start me about the Royal Bank of Scotland. One of the good things that the EU did is it fined Royal Bank of Scotland and the other banks €2 billion. The Royal Bank of Scotland agreed, by the way, that it acted as a criminal cartel, right? Not one of those directors in prison, not one of them prosecuted, not one of them banged up, not one of them made to pay for the fact that they systematically set out to defraud their own customers, and yet we say other countries should be like us. So again, it's the sugarcoating of saying, look, the city does a lot of wealth creation, a lot of good stuff, etc. But capitalism does have a bad face because greed and power and money that's what it says in the Bible. It's the source of all evil, and that says that for good reason.
So do you think there's, in a sense, a two-part question, really? To what extent do you think Eurocentrism is damaging for Europeans? And to what extent do you think sugarcoating of history for any group of people is potentially damaging in the sense that you're almost not equipped to resist the tyranny of your own society if you think you're inherently wonderful, inherently democratic, that essentially that progress is guaranteed?
Yeah, okay, so I think Eurocentrism has been an Achilles heel, but from what I understand from my publisher, a lot of people read my book on the Silk Roads, and if that tells you anything, it's that we are very open to reading about the past and to reinterpreting. So those ideas about Eurocentrism, they're not a disease that stay with you. That starts to water down. We start to think about the world in a different way, about different parts of the world, about how they fit in together, and it's great. And in fact, if I was sitting here saying nobody read it and it sold 2 copies, but actually it shows that we're quite well disposed to new ideas. So I'm quite pragmatic, optimistic, and great that a new generation of historians will start to realize that, in fact, there are other parts of the world, and things did happen between the Romans in Britain and the Battle of Hastings, incredibly. So that will change. I think other parts of the world, there is a sort of tyrannical view of how they teach history. History is absolutely front-page news in these countries. So in Turkey, for example, every year, more than 500,000 people take to the streets to celebrate a battle, the Battle of Manzikert, for those interested, that took place in 1071. And we had this moving experience with the First World War 100 years ago. If we said, right, lads, 1066, let's get out on the streets and celebrate it, I don't think you're going to get 500,000 people on the streets of London.
I don't think
right?
so.
Okay. So I think in Russia, there's a big discussion about Stalin and communism and the Bolshevik Revolution, and was the empire a good thing? The most viewed TV documentary in Russia in the last 5 years was a TV program about the Byzantine Empire and about how the West lied to and destroyed Constantinople in 1204. Right? These things are alive as topics and as subjects. Control of the past, how it's understood. So there is a lot of editing that goes on in other countries. And China's view of the Silk Road, saying this is great and so on, obscures the fact that the Chinese themselves never really paid much attention to people outside their own country, because generally people who are imperial don't really care. If you're in the States, you're convinced that New York or LA or Chicago is the best cities on earth. So why go to London? Why go to Paris? I got it all here. Right? That's a kind of normal default thing, right? You don't, and in Britain we sent, actually the British Empire was built by the Scots and the local peoples who did all the hard work. Here, if you were the Earl of whatever, you stayed in your country pile and count the cash as it comes back in, right? So I think that's not necessarily, that's a bit simplified for historians in the audience, right? But, I know how this works, the Twitter feed afterwards, right? But, in boiled down terms, but I think that China, and talking about the Silk Roads and how people have cooperated in the past despite religion and so on, that is broadly true, but what the hidden story is not that every now and again there were big dislocations, which there were, not very often compared to European history, but the thing that they don't talk about is that China never paid a great deal of attention to the countries outside. So it's more who's the glue in this story. And in my new book, what I try and write about is that what's striking is that the US particularly are trying to pin Russia and Iran and Pakistan and China all at the same time. And of course, a bit like at school, when the big guy picks on a bunch of you, then you all find a way to work together. And so it, funnily enough, strengthens the hand of other countries and pushes them together and finds a language where they do start to talk about ways in which they've cooperated in the past and they cooperate in the present and they cooperate in the future. And they remind each other that this is our neighborhood. The US, when it gets involved, it breaks stuff. Look what they did in Iraq. Look what they did in Afghanistan. They break stuff with climate change. They break stuff with, and they don't mention the fact that they're burning coal and fossil fuels and destabilizing Ukraine and et cetera, et cetera.
So everybody sort of uses history when it suits them.
But history's political, right? Yeah. And that's what a lot of your music's about too, right? Yeah. I mean, and you can use that in a positive way too. Yeah. You can use, and we were talking about it too, about how important education is and how important it is to get kids to think. And part of the challenge here in Britain is when we think about history, it's that rock-solid story. Ancient Greece, ancient Rome, Norman conquest, Henry VIII, and there's no space. It's inconceivable to me how an 18-year-old can leave school here without having studied the culture of Benin and the glory years of the 10th, 11th centuries, or could have understood anything about the Moche world of South America, or the Aztecs, or the Maya, or known about the Chola Empire, or the Srivijaya Empire, the Khmer. We don't even know these names, let alone where they are on the map. Or my favorite fact, the city of Merv in Turkmenistan, that maybe one or two of you have been to, it was the biggest city in the world from the year 800 until 1221. And definitely no one can name that. So I think that part of it is encouraging young people to think about the past and to ask questions rather than to just memorize stuff.
Oh, beautiful. And on that note, I think we are going to open to some questions from the audience. I believe we've got a roving mic just there at the back. If someone gives us a signal when we've got like 5 minutes to go, then we will... Do you want to pick or shall I?
You're used to these lights, right? But I can't see anything.
All right, no worries. So I'll pick one here. We'll take 3 in a go, 2, 3, and then I will move to some people near the back. Sorry we'll see. Nice hoodie, by the way.
Thank you. My name is Christina. I am an alien. I come from another country. We learned nothing about the native peoples of my country in our education, nor did we learn the kind of education you're talking about. I just want to throw up a couple of threads. One is about education, about curiosity. The other one is about music. And just to pick one thing out is what Daniel Barenboim did with the West East Band Orchestra. A, travelled the world. B, sat Palestinians next to Israelis. And they were not there to talk about politics. They were just to learn to cooperate and communicate. So particularly you being a musician and the sorts of things you've been talking about, Peter, could you say something about the possibility, what comes through?
We'll talk about hip-hop Shakespeare. That's your,
Not even just hip-hop Shakespeare, but hip-hop actually. I've through the Hip-Hop Shakespeare Company, we've worked in maybe 30 countries around the world. I've worked with Javanese hip-hop artists. I've worked with hip-hop artists in Zimbabwe. Hip-hop has become a sort of global lingua franca for young people. And what's really fascinating to me is it's often not the version of hip-hop projected by American corporations and MTV. It's the actual culture, what we, who are proper hip-hop heads, I'm a hip-hop snob, there's no secret there, would call sort of the 5 elements: DJing, breakdancing, graffiti, MCing. But really importantly, something people forget about is knowledge, which was the 5th element of hip-hop, which was always added in. And you see all around the world, in Iran, in so many places, young hip-hop artists gravitate into that, hip-hop as socio-political commentary, as a voice of dissent. We see this in Senegal recently. In fact, 2 or 3 elections in Senegal, the hip-hop artists in Senegal have played a kind of central role there. So I would say that music has always had that, but now more than ever, and ironically, this culture of sort of, in a sense, a persecuted minority in the United States, becoming a global lingua franca says a lot about some of the positives of the modern world, I would argue.
Totally agree. And, your documentary about the Odyssey is exactly like, how do these things sound? And what epic does in the Persian world, the Shahnameh, written in the 11th century by Ferdowsi, that, like the Aeneid or the Iliad or hip-hop, it provides a kind of common framework where people recognize the sounds. They get included by these kinds of things. And so music and cooperation and so on, that's our species at its finest, when we're curious, when we're open, when we want to listen and we want to replicate. And that's what makes us interesting as people. The fact we want to murder each other and persecute is obviously us in our worst side.
Absolutely. Who did I say was two? Was it there and then there? Oh, you've already got the mic, so you go ahead, and then it'll be this lady here.
Yeah, I'm a massive fan of both your work, by the way. So my question starts with a quote from George Bernard Shaw, the Irish poet. A healthy nation is as unconscious of its nationality as a healthy man of his bones. And what we've witnessed over the last couple of years in both the UK and the US is a rise of nationalism and xenophobia. And I don't want to say rise of, but an increase in visibility of white supremacy. Now, this is to both of you. Can you just give like an explanation or what your take is on the context of history that is driving this?
I think it's a very good question. I think what's hard is to contextualize this. These very high-profile cases of, the marches in Charlottesville and so on in the States were horrific. But it's not a very large part of the population. Like Akala says, actually we're pretty good. We can focus on these awful cases where they rightly become front-page news, but that can distort the reality. So, when you have these kind of surveys which said, what percentage of the population are this or that or whatever, people are off the charts by miles. I mean, they're not even close to their assumptions. And getting rid of prejudices is difficult, but when they seem to get reinforced, it's a real challenge. So, I think that in my role as a historian looking at primarily non-European cultures, is to try to say that there's the language of this sort of intolerance and reaction is to do with the fact that it seems clear to people that life is becoming harder. And when things are becoming tougher, you turn on people. And you can turn on the Hispanic population in the United States, you can turn on immigrants here, you can turn on whatever you like, you can try and propose all sorts of solutions politically, economically, and so on. But it's normally a symptom of the fact that you're convinced that things are becoming tougher. And from my perspective, there is some truth in that. And it's how do you come to terms? How do you adapt? And there's a Dutch politician I did something with a while ago, and he said, he was very struck by Charles Darwin, and I said, so you're eccentric. Yeah, another scientist. He said, it's all about survival of the fittest. And it's adaptability that's key. If you can adapt, if you can get on with people, if you can find a way of putting differences between you to one side and get on with things, then that's much to your credit and to your forte. And that requires work. We can all choose when to argue. We know that in our personal relationships with our friends, with our families. And the discipline of saying, I'm prepared to not fight over this one, is something which can give way quite quickly. And in my view, it's the responsibility of politicians to talk responsibly about these kinds of things. And there is a series of politicians, not just about race, not just about tolerance, not just about minorities, which seem to be extremely irresponsible in the futures that they're promising. And we should punish them at the elections.
I think also, to a certain extent, politicians are very good at manipulating, these kinds of fears and these kinds of issues when it suits them. So if we think, for example, about the phrase ethnic minority in Britain, most people, when we talk about post-war mass migration, and these two things are interlinked, most people in Britain are entirely unaware, generally, that more people came to Britain from Ireland and post-war Europe than from India and the Caribbean combined. And this is not an accident. The British state did this quite deliberately. They subsidized the people that came from Europe and Ireland because they believed they could make proper Brits of them, while rejecting the migration of people that came from the Caribbean and India, even though they were by law British citizens, and even though they were paying for themselves. So sometimes some of these kind of latent racist ideas, same in the United States, are manipulated by the state, and then they sort of suddenly say, well, look at these ignorant, evil, working class racist people. But they pick and choose when they're going to manipulate and use those fears and those ideas. It was one of the other questions I was going to ask you, if you think, but because I'm not sure about this. If you think comparisons to the 1930s are vastly kind of wildly exaggerated, you see all around now, and I don't know what to make of this historical moment. You see if the genuine danger of state-led fascism in Europe. Do you think that is a valid concern, or you think it's overblown? Or in the States?
Trump and Farage, I think they're twats, but I don't think they're genocidal maniacs, right? So I think that they pander to a population that hears what they want to hear. But I think it's quite dangerous to be comparing this to sort of some of the most evil people in human history. And I think we've got to have a context for all of it. And you might not share their politics and so on. I think it's trying to understand that, to an extent, Trump and Brexit and Farage and so on, they're a symptom, right, of what is actually going on in the world. There is a logic to the idea that things are becoming tougher, so let's take our destiny into our own hand. But when I watched Titanic, DiCaprio did that, and on balance, he should have got in the bloody lifeboat with Kate Winslet rather than float on the door, right? So sometimes when there's a crisis, you make these kind of decisions, and I think that the logic of saying it's all going to hell in a handcart, Europe is shot, let's get out quickly as fast as we can. There is some logic to it, but as it happens quite often, the reason I go to see a doctor is I say, well, the fact I feel ill, what should I do? And I would trust my doctor to give me the right advice. The problem is we live in a world where experts, they're finished. So we don't listen to the experts. It's all let's go on our feeling and our gut instinct. And again, we've seen that repeatedly in these discussions there's going to be a shortage of clean water. The chemicals used to purify water are too unstable. We've got a 24-hour supply. And we get a minister or we get someone, a politician saying, it's just not true, right? And you can't argue with that when somebody just says, I just don't believe you. So, it's c'est la vie.
These will be our last two questions. So we've got one here. I have to take one from the back. I'm really sorry.
Is anybody young? Anybody under the age of 21 is anybody under the age of 21 who's got a question? Let's take a youngster.
Go on. Are you really under the age of 21?
You guess
I know black don't crack and all that, bro, but good. But I could tell you was over the age of 21. You get
points though for trying, right?
You tried. I feel bad. I'm sorry. So I mean, this lady here, and then you, who I think may well be. I feel bad. I've been told only 2 questions. I'm sorry.
Okay, so firstly, thank you for starting a really important discussion. I think one thing I wanted to check in on is you've talked a lot about the gaps in history, global history, but less about the lack of understanding of our impact on the world through colonialism, not just historically, but in present day. And I wonder whether you could talk a little about that and what responsibility we have. The way the Middle East looks today is in large part because of us. The fact that Saudi Arabia looks the way it does is in large part because of us. And that gives us a huge amount of responsibility. Ditto Africa, ditto Southeast Asia, South Asia. And I think also, just going back to your point about Afghanistan, in terms of presence engagement, there's a reason people have gone towards the Taliban and places like Daesh. It's because there was huge amounts of corruption, and our engagement refused to acknowledge that. And that's something that I think we need to really think about. If the world is changing and our power is weakening, how we are perceived really does matter. So I'd love to hear your comments on that. Thanks.
Sure. I mean, I recognize those criticisms. I recognize that narrative. I think the danger of that is it removes all agency from local populations, right, from local leaders and so on and so forth. And one has to try to understand these things. They go side by side. I think it's very easy to say, look, everything that goes wrong in the Middle East is all the fault of the West. The West wasn't trying to mess things up, by and large. In the case of the post-First World War settlements, clearly the decisions that got made were quite self-serving and highly counterproductive. But one has, I think, one has a responsibility to try to be balanced in all these things and not say the reason why Syria is on fire is because decisions made by white men 102 years ago, because it's more complicated than that. And it removes criticisms of Assad or his inner core or the corruptions and the problems that they've had too. So I think it's difficult to find balance. I can see you shaking your head, so I'm sure you've got a very strong opinion about it that might be different. But that is why it's important to have historians. It's why it's important to look back in the past. And I'm not here to try to beat people over the head. I'm very willing to listen to other people's views and opinions. I saw, in fact, last week I opened an exhibition at the British Museum, which has the map by Sykes and Picot, which, as you'll know, wasn't the map that was used to create a settlement, but it was largely driven by Britain's oil interests at the end of the First World War. But since then, a lot has happened too. And it's true, I think, if you read my last book, the West and Britain and the US have made the same mistake again and again and again. But these mistakes don't get made on purpose, and sometimes it's a little bit harder than it looks. So I'm not a defender, as you know. I'm very critical of engagements of colonialisms and so on, particularly the worlds that I know about. And I do the best I can. But I think these are all tricky subjects. And in fact, when you say the Middle East, it depends exactly where you mean. Some countries like Lebanon and Jordan, hugely resilient. Lebanon has got 4 million in population. It's got 2 million refugees from Syria. They do quite a good job in balancing ethnic minorities, religious minorities. It's a pluralistic, open world, which is, in some ways, maybe not perfect, and we can argue about how imperfect it might be. But, I think that there is an attempt, there has to be an attempt to try to not always let everybody locally off the hook. When people like Assad use chemical weapons, and when Assad murdered the Marsh Arabs and persecuted the Kurds, that's nothing to do with the West. Yeah, because we sold them the weapons and we kept them in place. Well, listen, I'll tell you, I totally agree, and I, like I said, I've read as much as I can. If you're a historian, which sounds like maybe you are, then you need to write about it, and I will read it with great pleasure. But I've researched this the best I can. I've been through all of Saddam Hussein's audio tapes that were found under the presidential palace. I've read through all of the classified and the redacted texts of everything produced in the US State Department from 1980 until today. And I've looked at all the Russian material that's available, I've looked at all the Iranian material that's available, and I've looked at all the local material that's available too. And in my assessment, evil people and dictators, whether it's Gaddafi, whether it's Saddam Hussein, whether it's Putin, whatever you like, they have to be contextualized correctly. And I've done the best I can, looking, as all historians should do, at the sources.
But I suppose... I suppose the difficulty would be, for me, is if we're willing to have a nuanced view of a Tony Blair, or of a Barack Obama, or even of a Donald Trump, to not have a nuanced view of people that may be perceived very differently in other parts of the world might be quite problematic to a certain degree. And I sort of take the point that I feel that we are still, to a degree, an imperial power, as is the United States, and almost as if there's a middle ground between acknowledging that everyone locally has agency, and there is problems locally that are not directly the result of our engagement, but also that we still have had massive impact and interference all around the world, not just 102 years ago, but
still now.
But
100%
very
agree.
recently.
100% agree.
We couldn't take the last one, never mind.
Go on, the girl, she's young, she's under 21.
It's not a she, it's a he.
He, sorry, I told you I can't see anything. Beg your pardon.
As long as it makes me look like younger, that's great. By the way, if that guy's under 21, you look mean. So I was going to say the first thing you said about history being rewritten retrospectively for a political message or something like that. That I completely agree. I agree that doesn't really matter if I agree with it. But
Dude, you got to ask a question.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I would wonder to what extent that process of trying to sort of twist it for a message is a continuous thing that we've been doing ever since our civilization, in quotation marks, started. Like, for example, Thomas Aquinas claimed to have written the first cosmological argument in 1200, and I don't know what, when actually the Kalam argument made by Islamic theorists had existed by a long time. So I wondered to what extent you thought that process of trying to rewrite history had been a long-standing, continuous thing.
Yes.
Over the past few thousand years.
Yes.
That's your answer. Thank you very much. Do we walk off now? I think it's time. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Take care.
Really appreciate it.